elementary school, Hoot. Now, I want you all to read my shirt. Not flat. He checked. So he has been up there and seen that the Earth is actually round. Now, Captain Gibson is not just an astronaut. He went to school to become an aerospace engineer. How many of you have a grown-up at home that's an engineer? Yup. Welcome to high school, everybody. How many of you have a grown-up at home who works at NASA? Okay, still pretty good. How many of you have a grown-up at home that's been to space? You have? Awesome. All right. Now, Captain Gibson was also in the Navy. He's a fighter test pilot. Guess what? How many of you have seen Maverick or Top Gun? He did that. He went to Top Gun school. Pretty neat, huh? I know, pretty awesome. Okay. Not only is he an astronaut, he was in the group of astronauts that got to go on the space shuttle the very first time. And he's been to space 5 times. I know. The first time he went as a pilot, because you gotta fly to get there, right? The next 4 times, he was the mission commander. You guys know what that means? He was the boss of all the other astronauts. So, Captain Gibson has done a whole lot in his career, and he has gotten so many awards that he takes up a lot of space on a resume. And we're all very proud to have him here, so let's give a warm Midtown welcome to Hoot Gibson.
All right, well, thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be here at Midtown Elementary School to talk to all of you about space. So, this picture, it's a little bit dark. I've got a couple of the photos that I have in, oh, wait a minute, let's see, we've got to push this button. Okay, all right, this should be working now. This is the Space Shuttle Discovery. And what's interesting about the Space Shuttle Discovery is that's the only space shuttle that I never flew. I flew the other 4. I flew Challenger, then Columbia, then Atlantis, then Endeavour, and then I should have flown Discovery, but I didn't. I flew Atlantis a second time on my final mission. However, is it only boys who get to be astronauts? No, women get to be astronauts too. So my wife, who I met in the space program, we met in 1978, and then we were married 3 years later in 1981. She flew Discovery on her first mission, and so she made 3 trips to space. Well, this was my first launch. This is the Space Shuttle Challenger, and I know when we watch the Space Shuttle lift off, it always looks like it's going so slowly as it lifts off. Let me tell you, it is not slow at all. By the time the tail of the space shuttle is up here, even with the top of the tower, we're already 100 miles an hour. So it looks like it's very slow because the space shuttle is so big. It just doesn't look like it's going as fast as it is. It only takes us 8.5 minutes to get to space. And when we get to space, we're going 17,500 miles an hour. This is where we are at just 2 minutes, and this picture, it looks like we're going down, doesn't it? No, we are not going down. What has happened is we are high enough at this point that we're through the thick part of the atmosphere, the thick part of Earth's air, and now we start following the curvature of the Earth. So we're following Earth's curve, but we're still going up. We are still gaining in altitude at this point. And where are we? Well, right here. We're 30 miles up over the Atlantic Ocean. We're 30 miles out over the Atlantic Ocean. And we're already going 3,000 miles an hour at just 2 minutes after liftoff. So it is really an exciting ride. What we're about to do is we are about to separate the two solid rocket boosters from the space shuttle. And this is what that looks like. We cut the bolts that hold them to the space shuttle, and then you can see there are rocket motors on the nose and on the tail that push them away from us, because those booster rockets, even though we've emptied out 1 million pounds of fuel out of them, they still weigh 88,000 pounds. These are great big heavy steel cases. You don't want to recontact them after you cut them loose, so those rocket thrusters push them away from us to make sure we don't hit them. Now, on my first trip to space, we did a lot of exciting things. We launched 2 satellites, but the most memorable thing that we did was this. We sent 2 of our mission specialists outside, and people ask me all the time, Hoot, did you ever get to do a spacewalk? And the way I answer the question is no. As a pilot astronaut, I'm much too valuable to risk me outside. So we send all the mission specialists out, and if they don't come back, who cares? You know, okay, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. We care a lot. We care a whole lot. And what are we doing here? This was the world's first untethered spacewalk. You'll notice in this photo, this is Bruce McCandless. I can't see his face because he's got his gold visor down, but I can see the red stripes. And so he's marked as EV1, extravehicular 1, with the red stripes. Our other spacewalker, Bob Stewart, didn't have the red stripes on his suit, so that's how we could tell which one was which. And what he's doing here, he's flying a rocket backpack. This was the first time ever that an astronaut had been floating freely in space. Now, you've probably seen this photo before, right? I'm the one who took this photo. But it never, ever says on it, photo by Hoot. It just says photo by NASA. It never says Hoot Gibson took this photo, but now you know. Well, he has a camera up over his shoulder, his right shoulder. I'm going to show you a picture in just a second that he took with the camera. But he used his rocket pack to fly pretty far away, the length of a football field away. Now, people ask me all the time, what happens if he runs out of fuel? What happens if he has an electrical malfunction in his rocket pack and the rocket pack doesn't work and he can't fly back? What are we going to do? Well, the answer is we could fly Challenger over to him to pick him up if he offers us enough money. And we're going to agree on a price ahead of time. And only then are we going to fly over and rescue you. Okay, that never happened. Nothing like that happened. Here's the picture that he took of us. And Bob Stewart, our other spacewalker, is just barely in this photo. You can just barely see him right here. He's underneath the robot arm. This is his helmet, and these are his boots right here. So he's kind of hiding from us in that picture. Well, that gives you an idea of how big our cargo bay was. We had 2 satellites mounted back here, and we had a scientific experiment assembly up here and also here. And we had the big robot arm that we used to lift things out of the cargo bay. So this was the view up in space. You can see this was the Space Shuttle Challenger that I flew on my first mission. Now, Ms. Cindy mentioned at the beginning that I flew as the pilot on my first mission. That actually means co-pilot. The astronauts, the pilots, the 2 pilot astronauts were called the commander and the pilot. So I flew my first mission as the co-pilot, and then the other missions, the commander is actually the pilot in command. So the commander is the one who makes the landing and flies the rendezvous and the docking. So that was what we looked like when we're up there in orbit. We came back, and we made the very first landing by a space shuttle back at Cape Canaveral. This was the first time in history that a spaceship had landed at the same place where it took off from. Here's our launch pads over here in the background. So this was the very first landing back at Cape Canaveral, way back in 1984. And this was the 10th time that we had sent a space shuttle to space. Well, I'm not going to bore us with all 5 of my flights. I'm just going to show a couple slides from a couple of the flights. This was liftoff on my 4th mission, and we were a science mission. We had the Space Lab laboratory back in the cargo bay, and I'll show you a picture later of where the Space Lab laboratory is in the space shuttle. But we were doing more than 40 different material sciences and life sciences experiments aboard the space shuttle. This was aboard Endeavour. And Endeavour was the space shuttle that we built to replace the Challenger after we lost the Challenger. Now, do we walk? Oh, what we're going to do, we're going to do questions after I finish showing all the slides, okay? Do we walk when we're up in space? Do we walk anywhere? Do we have to climb stairs? No, we fly everywhere we go. So if I tried to stand on the floor, what would happen? I would float away, yes. So here's how, right here, here's how we keep ourselves in one spot. You just need these little foot loops. Now you notice nobody's wearing shoes. Do we need to wear shoes? No, we're not walking anywhere. So everybody just wears socks. And that's all you need is just one little foot loop to slip your foot into. So now I have both hands free to write in my notebook. And what we're doing, we had worked 24 hours a day. So around the clock, we were working on the science experiments back in the Space Lab laboratory. And so half of my crew was the red crew, and the other half was the blue crew. So while the red crew was working, the blue crew would be sleeping, and then every 12 hours, we'd hand off to the other shift. Now, it's so handy to be weightless, okay? Because in this picture, you notice I'm taking notes in my notebook of what we got accomplished on the previous shift. When it's time for me to turn the page, I just park my pen right here and let go of it, and I flip the page and I grab my pen and I continue to write. Can we do that down here? No. Now you get in the habit of doing that. And so one of our crews came back from space, and when we would get back to Houston, at the end of the trip, there was always a huge crowd of people waiting to welcome us home. And one of the astronauts, Dale Gardner, was signing an autograph book, and he signed the page, and the nice lady said, "Oh, sign the next page too." So he parked his pen right there, and he flipped the page, and he went, "Where'd my pen go? It's supposed to be right here." So you get in a habit of doing that, and things like this are what people look at us and say, you know what, these poor guys, they must have had a lack of oxygen while they were up there in space, or their brain must have been bombarded by space radiation, and it fried their brains is why this happens. Nevertheless, it's very handy to be able to just park something for a moment while you flip the page and work in space. So we stayed up for 8 days on that mission, and like I say, we had 40 different life sciences and material sciences experiments that we were doing on that mission. Came back and landed back at Cape Canaveral. Now for my final mission, I trained over here. Yeah, somebody already, I was gonna say, okay, where is this? Russia, yes, this is Red Square in Moscow. My crew and I trained over in Russia twice for a total of about 20 days altogether, because we got selected to do the very first docking ever done by a space shuttle. So over the years leading up to this, we would fly space shuttles up into orbit, we would launch satellites from them, we recovered satellites, we repaired satellites, we did all kinds of exciting things that had never been done before, but we had never docked with anything until I docked the space shuttle Atlantis with the Russian space station Mir. So my crew and I had to learn to speak Russian, because the Russians we were working with couldn't speak English, and back then Russia was so poor that they couldn't afford to buy English textbooks or hire English teachers, so we had to learn to speak Russian. Now I'm an engineer, like so many of your parents. I'm an engineer, so I'm very good with physics and science and mathematics and all of that, but not so good at languages. So learning Russian is kind of a tough language to learn. So here's what I know best in Russian. Anytime I'm going to speak Russian to somebody, I will start off by telling them this. Я говорю по-русски очень плохо и понимаю ничего, which is, I speak Russian very badly and I understand nothing. Because I don't want them to be expecting too much. But during the launch, I had a replacement Russian crew for the Mir space station. I had two cosmonauts named Anatoly and Nikolai going to space with me, who became very good friends. They became very good friends of mine. But they couldn't speak English. And so what happens during the launch if I needed to tell them something like this? Извините, пожалуйста. У нас есть маленький пожар на борту прямо сейчас. Which is, excuse me please, we have a small fire on board right now. So we needed to be able to speak in Russian. That didn't happen, but we needed to be able to talk to them in Russian. So I am not really very good in Russian, but to this day I can still carry on a very poor conversation in Russian. I docked with this end of the space station. This is a module that was called Crystal. And just for comparison, the Russians fly up and down to and from space in this vehicle, which is called Soyuz, which means Union in Russian. And so that's their Soyuz vehicle. It's like a small Apollo capsule. It holds 3 astronauts and that's all. And it's really tight. My crew and I trained to fly it when we were over in Russia, but we never did. We just did it in the simulators. Well, here's the approach to docking. What I had to do was fly my docking ring, it's about a 4-foot diameter ring right here, up and into contact with the docking ring on the Mir space station. And they said, Hoot, you have to line the centers of these up within 3 inches. If you're farther off than 3 inches, you will just bounce off and you won't dock. So we trained very, very extensively for the docking. We had done probably close to 100 practice dockings in the simulators before we went to space. And it all paid off. I told you I'd show you the space lab. This is the space lab laboratory mounted back in the cargo bay, and that's the picture I showed you just a moment ago, where we were doing a shift change. And I was making notes in my notebook. So we're both doing 17,500 miles an hour, and I have 3 inches of margin to play with. So you had to be pretty darn accurate. The plan was, when we got there, the 2 mission commanders are to shake hands. So in this photo, I'm shaking hands with Russian Air Force Colonel Vladimir Dezhurov, who had been a Russian MiG pilot, training to shoot me down. All those years that as a Navy fighter pilot, I was training to shoot him down. And we shook hands at the hatch, and the President of the United States announced that day that this handshake marks the end of the Cold War. So I tell everybody, I am the one who ended the Cold War. It makes a funny story. Well, we were docked to the Russians for 5 days. Oh, thank you. It makes a funny story. But it actually was at the time pretty much the end of the Cold War. Now we need to end another Cold War that's going on. And in fact, it's taking place right here. This is Ukraine. This was a photo that we took when we went over into the Russian space station while we were there with one of our cameras, and we took this photo, and where we are is over the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is the traditional boundary between Europe and Asia, where this is Europe in this direction, Asia in this direction, and the landmass under the clouds here, that's Turkey. So that's Asia. And that's where we are. And this is the Crimean Peninsula, which has been very much in the news lately, unfortunately, because of the war in Ukraine. And I used to be very fond of my friends, the Russians, and ever since the Ukraine situation happened, I'm not so fond of the Russians these days. It was quite the experience to work with them. But this is a photo that we took while we were docked. And here's what we looked like. Now, the way we got this photo, I'll be darned, how did we get this photo? Because nobody did a spacewalk. Well, Soyuz is missing. from this end of the station. So Anatoly and Nikolai, who stayed behind to spend 5 months in space aboard the station, they climbed into the Soyuz capsule and they undocked and moved out to the side 60 meters away, or about 200 feet away. And they took this photo just before we detached, and then this picture as we were separating away. We flew around the space station for 3 orbits to get photos of it from all different angles, because we wanted to characterize what kind of shape is it in, because the core module, the very heart of it right here, had been in space for 9 years at that point. So we wanted to characterize what kind of shape it was in. Some of the things we saw, these big solar panels, that's how they get their electrical power, is from these big solar panels. They had holes in them from micrometeorites and space debris, and we also saw some darkening of the surfaces of the actual space station itself. And here's Soyuz docked back again to the space station after they had taken the photos of us. Well, one of the cool things about being in space, as you can imagine, I'm sure, is the view of the Earth. What is this? Yes, a hurricane. This Hurricane Ian has been very much in the news over the past week, but this was Hurricane Bonnie that we took this photo of from Endeavour on my 4th mission, and you can obviously see the eye of the hurricane, and you can see all these big spiral bands of thunderstorms and tornadoes that wrap out around a hurricane. But watching the view from space of the Earth is always just fascinating. This is a picture that we took, and this is Egypt. We're looking at the Nile River. Now you probably know the Nile River flows from south to north and into the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the delta of the Nile River, and you can see it is huge. The delta is just huge. From space, the only things on Earth that look gray color or silver are cities. So right here at the tip of the delta, this is Cairo, the capital of Egypt. Under the tail of Endeavour here, this is the Suez Canal that was dug through the desert so that ships can sail from the Mediterranean Sea through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea, and then that gets them into the Indian Ocean without having to sail south around the southern tip of Africa. Now, the bright spots in the sand right here, those are the pyramids. So you can actually make out where the pyramids are, right next to Cairo, Egypt. Okay, what do you suppose this looks like at night? Looks pretty spectacular at night, doesn't it? Yeah, it really does. And what's interesting, well, there's lots of interesting things in this picture. Along the Nile River, man, oh man, there are a lot of people living along the Nile River and in the Delta, because we humans need water, don't we? We need water very badly. So where there's water, there's us. Where there isn't much water, like out here, there aren't many of us. And I used to say, I have no clue who this is out here. But you guys sure are out there on your own. Well, last week, I had a young man that I talked to. I showed this slide over at Space Camp last week. And he came up, and I said the same thing. I said, I have no clue who this is way out here, but you guys are sure out there by yourselves. Well, this young man from Egypt came up to me afterwards, and he said, I know who that is out there. He said, those are monasteries out there in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So I learned something last week. I didn't know who this was. I've been always saying, holy smokes, what are you guys doing out there in the middle of the wilderness like that? So now I know. What about this green glow? What do you suppose that is? Okay, I'm hearing a whole bunch of different answers. You know what it is? That's Earth's atmosphere. That's our air. That's Earth's air. Okay, we gotta be real quiet. That's Earth's air. It's a band of atmosphere that's about 85 miles thick, and that's what lets us live and breathe here on the surface of the Earth. At night, it takes on a little bit of the ambient lighting, and it forms this kind of greenish glow, and it's what we astronauts call the air glow. The air glow is what we see at night. So, okay, all right, here's a quiz for you. Where's this? No, actually, it's shaped like a boot. Yes, Italy. So anyway, Italy shaped like a big boot. Sicily, once again, the air glow. This is a reflection in the window of the spaceship, so it's not something that's outside. We get to see a lot of sunrises and sunsets, because we are circling the Earth in an hour and a half. Only takes us 90 minutes to go all the way around the Earth. So therefore, we are in the daylight for 45 minutes, in the dark for 45 minutes, daylight for 45 minutes, dark for, you get the idea. We watch the sun go up and down 16 times a day when we're up there in space. Okay, that's kind of pretty, but that's not the prettiest thing we get to see from space. I was talking to a school one time, and I said, okay, the next slide is going to be the prettiest thing that we see from space. One of the kids shouted out, Las Vegas. Well, Las Vegas is kind of pretty, but it's not this pretty. Right. Yes. Now, we get to see two auroras. Now, most of us, because we live in the northern hemisphere, we're familiar with the northern lights, the aurora borealis. But there's also, and the auroras are a ring of light around the North Pole. There's also a ring of light around the South Pole, and that's the aurora australis, the southern lights. So we get to see both of those sets of lights. And it's happening at the top of Earth's atmosphere, and we're above Earth's atmosphere. So you can see we look down on the aurora from space. So that's the prettiest thing that we get to see from orbit. Okay, time to come back and land. When the space shuttle would re-enter Earth's atmosphere, this is what it would look like. Now this is actually a model of a space shuttle in a device called a wind tunnel, where we test how airplanes fly in Earth's air. And you can see that when we would re-enter, we create this enormous, strong shock wave around the space shuttle, because we are going 25 times the speed of sound. Mach 25. And jet fighters only do about Mach 2, or Mach 2.5. And so the space shuttle, we're doing 25 times the speed of sound. The temperature in this shock wave is 9,000 degrees. And so here's what it looks like looking out the window. It looks like the air is on fire. It looks like the air is burning, because it's 9,000 degrees right outside your window. You can actually feel the heat through the window. Holding your hand up, you can feel heat coming through the windshield. So we fly surrounded by fire for about 15 minutes, and then we are a great big 230,000 pound glider. And so as a glider, how many tries do we get to land it? One, exactly one try. And we hold the landing gear right until the last second, because it glides pretty poorly with the landing gear up. It glides even more poorly with the gear down. So we hold the wheels until we are 300 feet above the ground. And then we put the landing gear down, and then we get stopped using this big drag parachute to help us slow down, because our touchdown speed is 235 miles an hour. So you have this 230,000 pound monster going 235 miles an hour. So it takes a lot of work to get it stopped. And then if you've done everything right and you survived your mission because you did everything right, you got to pose for cool photos like this one. Now this was right after the docking flight, the Mir docking flight. There were actually 8 of us on board coming back because I picked up 3 cosmonauts from the Mir space station, gave them a ride home, but they had been up in space for 4 months at that point. So we put them in wheelchairs and we put them into rehabilitation when we get them back. The other person who's missing, I had a medical doctor as part of my crew, Dr. Ellen Baker, and she's helping with the 3 cosmonauts who are in wheelchairs at this point. Well, you probably know, 11 years ago, we launched the last flight of the space shuttle. It was Atlantis. It went to the International Space Station on I think it was a 12-day mission, and they came back and landed in the dark 12 days later to finish off 135 times that we had flown the space shuttle. Well, we didn't have our own rocket at that point anymore because we retired the space shuttles, but we still needed to get here to the International Space Station. So we were paying the Russians to carry our astronauts up to the space station and back. And the Russians were charging us $73 million per person to carry our astronauts up there. Well, I am really happy to report that no longer are we paying the Russians $73 million because we now have SpaceX. And we have the SpaceX Crew Dragon vehicle that launches on top of the Falcon 9 rocket, and the SpaceX flies itself to space. The astronauts just monitor it on their big touch screens. They don't actually fly it. And the Crew Dragon docks itself. So I don't have to line it up within 3 inches. It lines itself up within 3 inches. I never got to fly it. And they're probably not going to let me fly because I already had 5 turns going to space. We also have another rocket built by Boeing that's called the Starliner, and it just flew its first successful mission unmanned a couple of months ago, and so we have that vehicle to carry our astronauts back and forth to and from the International Space Station. Okay, the final slide that I have for us is the future. This is the future of NASA spaceflight, and this is the biggest rocket ever built. It's bigger than the Saturn V, and this is a rocket called the SLS rocket, the Space Launch System, also called the Artemis program, and it's going to launch next month for the first time. This is bigger than the Saturn V. Yes, that's going to be exciting. Next month. The potential launch dates are November the 14th, or November the 16th, or November the 19th. It's going to be unmanned because we're going to fly a first test flight without any astronauts on board. It's going to go back to the moon. They're not going to land on the moon, but they're going to go to the moon in the Orion capsule, which is the Orion vehicle up here. It's going to go to the moon, it's going to orbit the moon for 6 to 12 days, I think is the time frame. And then Orion is going to come back to Earth and land in the ocean. We're going to retrieve it, and we're going to reuse all the electronics that were on board the Orion capsule. So that part's going to get reused. The second time that we launch Artemis, the SLS rocket, we're going to have American astronauts on board, and they're going to go back to the moon. They're not going to land on the moon, but they're going to orbit the moon again for probably 6 to 10 days and then come home. The third time we launch Artemis, we're going to land Americans on the moon once again. Now, back in the late 60s and the early 1970s, did we ever put a woman on the moon? So who do you suppose is going to be the first person to set foot on the moon? A woman. Yes, we are finally going to put a woman out of the spacecraft and onto the moon. And so that's going to be really exciting. Now, this is a couple of years away, but yeah, that's going to be exciting, isn't it? It's probably going to be 2 years from now, or maybe 3 years from now, but that's what's going to happen. So this is the future of NASA, is the SLS rocket. It has enough power to go back to the moon, and it even has enough power to take us to Mars. And so NASA would like to send astronauts to Mars probably in the 2030s time frame. So who'd like to go to Mars? I'd like to go to Mars. But you know what? They're probably going to tell me. They're probably going to tell me two things. One of them is going to be, Hoot, you've been to space 5 times. Haven't you had your fair share? And well, okay, yeah, the answer is yes. I probably had my fair share of space flights, so they're probably not going to let me go again. But some of you are the ones that will be the right age to get to go to Mars and beyond. So this is the future. I've told you a lot about the past, and this is the future. So let's see how we go. We probably got a couple of minutes. We can probably...
We have a couple of classes where 2 or 3 wrote down their question.
Oh, okay.
So if you have your question written down, there were 2 or 3 of you, just 2 or 3 of you, raise your hand with your question written down.
And this is Lynn's class and this is Lacey's class. If you have a question written down, yes? Where are you? If you have your question written down. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Okay.
You guys those first. Since they prepared, and then we
All right,
can.
so you have questions written down. Okay, let you read it. Okay, how do you feel when you come back from space? Okay, that whole time, my longest mission was 10 days. So, have I been walking for 10 days? No, I've been floating around weightless for 10 days. So when you get back and you stand up against gravity for the first time, you find yourself saying, you know what? This gravity stuff really stinks. It was really fun being weightless, but when you go to stand up after being weightless for all those days, you feel like you weigh about 400 pounds. And it takes you a while to get used to gravity again. So it was really fun to be weightless up there. But gravity really stinks when you have to come back. So anyway, yeah, great question. Okay, who else has? Oh, okay. Okay, so one of you needs to read the question.
No.
How did it feel to go to space?
All right, well, how did it feel to go to space? Well, I mentioned that it only takes 8.5 minutes to get to a speed of 17,500 miles per hour. That's kind of hard to picture, isn't it? Because that's kind of a big number. Well, what it equates to is you are covering 5 miles in 1 second. So in 4 seconds, you have covered 20 miles across the Earth. So there's a lot of acceleration, there's a lot of buffeting and vibration as you're on your way to space, but it's really an exciting ride. And again, it's only 8.5 minutes long. So it's really an exciting ride. It's a lot of fun. I got to do it 5 times. I'd like to do it again, but I probably won't get to. Okay, who else has written questions? Okay. Who's got? Somebody's got to read it. Who gets to read it? You can do it. You know you can do it.
Why did you want to be an astronaut?
Okay, great. Why did I want to be an astronaut? Well, it was a lot of fun, wasn't it? you saw all the slides of all the cool things that we got to do, the view of the earth that we got to see. So it is so exciting, and the space shuttle was the world's fastest airplane. It flies higher and faster than any other airplane ever. And I had been, as I mentioned, I had been a jet fighter pilot, and I flew the F-14 Tomcat, like the airplane in the Top Gun movie. I flew those. In fact, I was in the first Tomcat squadron. And so when the space shuttle came along, I said, you know what, this is even higher and faster than my Tomcat, so I want to fly this. And so I was so lucky I got to do everything I ever wanted to do. Okay, who else has a written question that they want to read? You do? Okay, how do you use the bathroom in space? It's a funny question, and we always get a little laugh out of it. But okay, think about this: if we've got 7 people locked up in a big aluminum can for 10 days, then there better be a working bathroom. And on my first mission, there were 5 of us locked up for 8 days. And on the 3rd day of the mission, the toilet failed. So I was the co-pilot on my first mission, so I was the one trained in maintenance. So I had to get into the toilet and repair it. But you had to do that because you really need a working toilet. Okay, so how does it work? It doesn't have gravity to help us, does it? And gravity does something very good for us down here on the earth. It makes everything go away from you. And you still want that to happen up in space. You want everything to go away from you. Well, we don't have gravity, so what we use is airflow. So right up at the toilet seat, air is injected into the toilet. It flows down into a holding tank. And that's how we control where everything goes. So we're using airflow to take everything away from us. And it has worked very well. It failed on my flight. We figured out what was wrong with it, and we repaired that. And then after that, we had lots of good success. So it worked just fine after that. Let's see if I can do it. A couple more minutes. Who else had written questions for me? Well, I was already over there. I'm trying to move around some. Do you have a written question? Okay, how do you sleep? Well, what we didn't have a big fancy bed or anything like that. What we had was a little lightweight cotton sleeping bag that just one layer thick. You would crawl into this little sleeping bag, and then you would tie it someplace so that you're not floating around in space and bump your head and wake up. So my first night in orbit, I was the last person to go to bed, and so all the good spots were already taken. So I slept on the ceiling. Okay, now we don't normally do that here. Okay, but we're not normally weightless either. You can sleep anywhere. You can sleep on the wall. You can sleep on the floor, you can sleep on the ceiling, you can sleep in midair. So what I did every night after that was, I was the co-pilot on my first mission, so I slept in my seat. I slept in the co-pilot seat. And then when I was mission commander, I always slept in the commander's seat. Now this doesn't sound very comfortable, but I would get in my sleeping bag, get into the seat, put the seatbelt around me very loosely just so that I wouldn't float away. Now I'm not really sitting down. I'm floating in midair above my seat. So you can sleep anywhere. You can just literally sleep anywhere. And it works very well. So 2 more. Okay, 2 more. Let's see if I can talk to anybody. Here, go ahead.
what happens if you were not attached to any place? And I mean, no. So, how do you have? What if the spaceship runs out of air? What would you do?
Okay, if the spaceship ran out of air, what would you do? You would not survive. So we had plenty of air. So if we were a 10-day mission, we would carry enough air for 10 days plus 2 extra days. So we would always carry more than enough air. And actually, we didn't carry air. What we carried was a tank of oxygen and a tank full of nitrogen. Because as you all know, I'm sure, down here on the Earth, we are breathing 20% oxygen, but 80% nitrogen. Well, that's the same thing that we did in the space shuttle, was we would flow nitrogen as well as oxygen into the cabin to keep the same blend of 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen. So anytime we got a little bit low on oxygen, we would flow oxygen. If we got a little bit low on nitrogen, we'd flow the nitrogen. So that's how we kept us pressurized, because we humans cannot live if we run out of air. So we really had to have lots of air. Okay, I have one more question. How about you? Yes. Challenger was the space shuttle that we lost during launch on January the 28th, 1986. It was the 25th time that we launched the space shuttle, and we had a failure in one of the booster rockets that let flame eject out the side of the booster rocket, and it caused the whole vehicle to be destroyed, and we lost all 7 astronauts. So Challenger, I flew on my first mission, and Challenger flew 9 times successfully, and then it was destroyed on its 10th launch. So many years ago, way back in 1986. All right, I think I have used up all of your time, so thank you for all your attention and all the great questions. Please be here again.